Hello, people. How have you been? Got a little something I want to read to you. It's called Non-Duality in Action. So let's have a little listen. I want to talk now about the aspect of Zen practice called going straight ahead. A student once asked the master, "What is the Tao? That is, what is the way?" And the master replied, "Walk on." Today we would say, "Go," as in, go, man, go. This aspect of Zen refers to detachment, having a mind that isn't sticky, or one that doesn't fumble, wobble, or hesitate. When Zen teachers ask students a question, they expect an immediate answer, one without premeditation or deliberation. In Zen, they speak of a kind of person who doesn't depend on anything. This means the person who doesn't rely on formulas, theories, or beliefs to govern their actions. It's very difficult for us to function this way. We've been brought up to believe that there are two sides to ourselves, an animal side and a human. That is to say, civilized. Freud referred to these as the side of a pleasure principle animal nature ID, and the reality principle social nature / superego. And in his view, these two sides of a person are in constant battle. Theosophists speak of a higher spiritual self and a lower psychic ego-oriented self. And if you look at these things in this way, the problem of life is to make your better self take charge of your lower self, like a rider taking charge of a horse. But here's the real problem. How would you know if what you think is your higher self isn't really your lower self in disguise? When a thief robs a house and the cops get called, they enter the house on the ground floor while the thief climbs the stairs to the next floor up. And when the police go up to that floor, the thief climbs up to the next. In the same way, when we feel ourselves to be the lower self, that is, a separate ego, the moralists come along and say, "Don't be selfish." So the ego tries to pretend it's good by identifying with the higher self. Why do you believe you have a higher self? Have you seen it? Do you know that it's there? No. You just want to do your duty to behave like a proper member of society. But that's all a great phony front. If you don't know there's a higher self and you believe that there is one, on whose authority do you believe this? Buddhists might cite the Buddha. Hindus may say the Upanishads. Christians will say Jesus. We are bound to believe that there is but one God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. The Catholics look down upon the Protestants for interpreting the Bible however they'd like, without any authoritative version. But this ignores the fact that Catholics choose to accept the authority of the Church to interpret the Bible for them. In other words, it must become clear to you that you yourself create all the authorities you accept. Otherwise, the whole thing is phony. Zen doesn't present a duality between a higher and lower self. If you believe in the higher self, it's just a simple trick of the lower self. If you believe there is no lower self, but only the higher self, or that the lower self is merely something for the higher self to shine through, that's just lending validity to the duality. If you think you have a lower self or an ego to get rid of, and you fight against it, nothing strengthens the delusion that it exists more than that. So this tremendous schizophrenia in humans of thinking they are rider and horse, soul in command of body, a will that must control passions, and so on. This kind of split thinking simply aggravates the problem. We just get more and more split. Thinking this way just results in an interior conflict that will never get resolved. You either know the true self or you don't. And if you do know it, then this thing we call the lower self ceases to be a problem because it's just a mirage. Well, you don't go around hitting at mirages with a stick or trying to put reins on them. You just know they're mirages and walk right through them. When I was a child, I did a naughty thing. My mother would say, "Allan, that's not like you." So I gained a conception of what was like me in my better moments. That is to say, the moments when I remembered what my mother would like me to do. That's the kind of split that's implanted in all of us. And because we're split-minded, we're always dithering. Is the choice I'm about to make from the higher self or the lower self? Is it of the spirit or of the flesh? And this message I receive from God or the devil, and nobody can decide, because if you knew how to choose, you wouldn't have to. You could think about it until you're blue, but you'll never get the answer because the problems of life are so subtle that to try to solve them with vague principles, even if those vague principles come in the form of specific moral instructions, is completely impossible. So it's important to overcome split-mindedness, but how? Where do you start if you're already split? The Taoist aphorism says, when the wrong man uses the right means work in the wrong way. So what are you to do? How can you get moving? Fundamentally, of course, you have to be surprised into it. Winthrop once interviewed a great Zen priest in Kyoto. The priest asked, "Who are you?" To which Winthrop replied, "I'm Winthrop Sargent." And the priest laughed. "No," he said, "I don't mean that. I mean, who are you really?" Well, this led to Sargent putting forth all sorts of abstractions about his being a particular human being, a journalist, a musician, and so on. And the priest just kept laughing. Eventually, the priest moved on to other topics. Sargent relaxed, and the priest eventually made some little joke. And Sargent laughed, and the priest said, "There you are." See, that laughter wasn't a deliberate response. A response of a non-deliberating mind is a response of a Buddha mind or an unattached mind. But this is not the same as a quick response, because if you get hung up on the idea of responding quickly, the idea of quickness becomes a form of abstraction. Sometimes Dr. Suzuki would respond to questions after a full minute of silence, but it was still a spontaneous response because during the silence, he was fishing around to think of something to say. He wasn't embarrassed by the silence or by not knowing the answer. If you don't know the answer, you can be silent. If nobody asks a question, you can be silent. There's no need to be embarrassed about it or get stuck on it. But you also can't overcome being stuck if you think that somewhere you would be guilty if you were stuck. When you are perfectly free to feel stuck and not stuck, then you're unstuck. Nothing can stick to the real mind. You'll find this out yourself if you watch the flow of your thoughts. What we call stream of consciousness or flow of thoughts is described in Chinese by repeating the character of thought 3 times. Nian, 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 thought, thought, thought. When you ruminate, thought follows thought. Thoughts rise and fall like waves on the water. And when thoughts fall away, it is as if they had never been. When you see this, you'll see that your mind doesn't really stick. It's just that you get the illusion of it sticking. You might experience a cycle of the same succession of thoughts that gives you some sort sense of permanence, but it's just an illusion. It's from all connecting thoughts together that we get the sensation that behind our thoughts, there is a thinker who controls the thoughts and experiences them. But the notion that there is a thinker is just a thought in the stream of thoughts. Thought, 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 thinker, thought, thought, thinker, thought, 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 thinker, and so on. And if this happens regularly enough, you get the illusion of there being someone who thinks apart from the stream of thoughts which come and go. So that's how we became split-minded. We think there is some real entity that stands aside from thoughts and chooses among them, controls them, regulates them, and so on. Actually, this is a way to not be able to control one's thoughts. The stronger the duality between thinker and thoughts, and feeler and feelings, is more the stream of sensations is coaxed into self-protective activity. It becomes more and more like a stuck record in order to protect and aggrandize and enlarge the status of the supposed thinker. If I say, walk or sit, but whatever you do, don't wobble, what am I saying? What kind of statement is that? When I raise that question, that is, what kind of statement is that? I'm beginning to talk about talking. And I can do that provided I don't try to do so while making the original statement. If I want to say something about what I just said, I must do it later, correct? But not at the same time. I cannot say you are a fool while simultaneously saying, and now I'm giving you an insult, in so many words, not unless I invent an exceedingly complex language that talks about itself as it goes along. I'm explaining this to illustrate how we get completely mixed up. In the middle of being about to express something, we start thinking about whether it is right or the best thing to say. In other words, we start wobbling. We start to get too much feedback, and too much feedback makes any mechanism go crazy. And when you become very aware of differences between the deeds and the doer is commenting on the deeds while doing them, the doer never really gets with it. You try to strike a nail with a hammer, and just as you're about to hit the nail, you wonder if it's the best place to put it. That's why you probably hit your thumb. You didn't go right through with hitting the nail. I'm not saying that there should be no criticism of thought. I'm saying that when you criticize thought while you're thinking, it makes you balled up and fundamentally confused. That's what's meant by the Sanskrit term klesha, a disturbing confusion of the mind. This kind of confusion in particular to humans, because we have language. And I use that word very inclusively. Words, images, numbers, notions, and so on. So because we can talk about anything, we can talk about talking, we can talk about thinking, we can talk about ourselves as if we could stand to the right and say, said I to myself, said I. But all we're actually doing is making a second thought that comments on the previous one while pretending that the second thought is a different one from the first. And we buy this because we believe all kinds of phony images about memory. For example, we think of memory in terms of engraving, as if we employed a flat and stable surface upon which to make marks that stay there for future review. We think that there is something stable upon which the passage of thoughts makes an impression. Does this sound familiar? The idea is directly related to the ancient superstition that the world consists of two elements, stuff and form. This is the ceramic model of the universe. God formed Adam out of the dust of the ground. So there is stuff on one side and form engraved upon it, imposed upon it, stamped upon it, like a seal stamped on wax. But what is stuff like apart from the form? And what is form like apart from the stuff? Nobody has ever seen a piece of shapeless stuff, and nobody has ever seen a piece of stuffless shape. They're the same thing. It isn't necessary to think of them to be different. There is process. There is the flow of thought. The flow of thought doesn't have to happen to someone. Experience doesn't have to beat upon some experiencer. It's just a stream happening that we convince ourselves that we stand to the side of and observe, because that's how we've been brought up. In my thought and experience, I am an object, a very fleeting and passing one. And you are an object, one that comes and goes. I think there is a me surrounded by an external world, and you think the same. But if you really think about that I am in your external world and you are in my external world, you will realize it is all one world that goes along together. There's no such thing as internal or external. It's all simply the process. So it's important to get rid of the illusion of duality between the thinker and the thought. Find out who the thinker is, the one who seems to be behind the thoughts. Who is the real, genuine you? Zen masters sometimes use shouting as a method. The master says, I want to hear you say the word mo and really mean it. I want to hear not just the sound, but the person who says it. Now produce that for me. And the student shouts, "Moo!" And the Zen teacher says, "Nope, that's not it." And the student yells, "Moo!" even louder. And the master says, "Not quite. It's all coming from your throat." And this goes on for a long time, because the true moo will never come while the student is still making a differentiation between a true moo and a false moo. To act with confidence, you just do it. People aren't used to that. So it's necessary to set up protected situations like the one above, in which it can be done. If we acted without deliberation in the ordinary way of social intercourse, we would get into amazing confusions. If we actually followed our patterns, advice to always tell the truth, for example, and we said what we truly thought about other people, we'd likely get in a great deal of trouble. But Zen offers a kind of enclosure within which to practice this sort of behavior. People get expert in it and learn how to apply it in all situations. Zen teachers put their students in the types of situations that would result in them getting stuck in a normal course of social relations. For example, they ask nonsensical questions like, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" And make impossible demands such as, "Touch the ceiling without getting up from your chair," or "Stop the sound of that train whistle." And when we interpret these questions or demands in an ordinary way, they're impossible. We have to go beyond our particular means of discourse. All these games we play, social games, production games, survival games, or good games, but we take them too seriously. We think that the I is the only important thing. So Zen works to unstick us from the notion. And in doing so, we realize that it would be just as good to come and drop dead now as it would be to go on living. Is a lightning flash bad because it only lasts a split second? Is a star good because it exists for billions of years? You can't make that sort of comparison. A world of lightning goes with a universe full of stars. Short-lived and long-lived creatures go together. That's the meaning of the poem. Flowering branches grow naturally, some short, some long. So I just wanted to read that little bit from Out of Your Damn Mind by Allan. And I found another gem by the other bloke who's lost his mind, thankfully. And I'll put a link to that video in the description below. You can check that out. Hope everyone has a great day, great life, and a great solstice, which is coming quickly in about 2 or 3 days here. Let me know in the comments below what you think's going to happen, what's going to take place. Anybody got any ideas? Let's hear them. And with that, I'll tell you love and light until next time, my friends and family. We're all a bunch of babies.